All right, more on this Labor leadership issue. And who would I go to ask about what it's like to be in the tough job of a federal Labor opposition leader? Well, no one less than One Nation leader in New South Wales, Mark Latham, who joins me now from Skype. Well, I tell you what, Mark Latham, sweeping changes today, much bigger than people have predicted. You've been on the inside of Labor machine, all the faction bother boys saying, you know, this bloke gets the job and not that one. To me, this was a signal of a leader's ending. It's the beginning of the end for Albanese. What does it say to you?
Well, it says that they can change the personnel around, but they've got a fundamental policy problem. Chris Bowen coming into climate and energy, he was the guy who, as the shadow treasurer before the last election, didn't or wouldn't produce any sort of modelling or costings on their core climate change policy, and that is net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And that's the key. The reason why Bowen wouldn't do it then, and Bowen won't do it before the next election, is that they know it's a wrecking ball through the Australian economy and jobs. Because a lot of jurisdictions have adopted this policy, but only one, New Zealand, has done the modelling. And what it showed, Peter, is you're throwing away 16% of household income, 16% of GDP, and many tens of thousands of jobs if you go down this carbon energy policy with basically 100% renewables. And that's in New Zealand, 16% gone over the next 30 years. Australia, the number would be much higher because we've got a high proportion of mining, transport and manufacturing in our economy.
And New Zealand had all of those carve-outs for agriculture, which is its main source of methane emissions. So notwithstanding that, it was in a parlous state with the modelling.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Australian numbers will be much higher. We're talking about your average family in Australia over the next 30 years, if Labor got in and started up this policy, sacrificing potentially 30% of their income and all the jobs that go with that. We're talking about regions like the Hunter Valley being wiped out in terms of economic viability. It is a wrecking ball. And I know a lot's been made about, oh, Shorten didn't produce the numbers, Shorten didn't do the modelling. They could do it. I mean, they get government money to do this through their so-called think tanks, but they won't do it because they know the numbers are horrendous. So inside the Labor Party, whether Mark Butler, Chris Bowen, Joel Fitzgibbon, they're all wedded to this 2050 policy, which is not all that far away. Their only debate is how heavily do they hide the reality of what it would do to the Australian economy, and some argument about how you get there, the rate of pace to get to the target of net zero carbon emissions 2050. And Peter, this madness is everywhere because it's the uncosted, unmodelled policy of the New South Wales Liberal Party government that's already gone down this path with their madcap electricity reforms. So a lot of this is just so disrespectful to jobs.
The whole reason they do this, though, is they know that if they do the 2030 modelling, we would expect that. As you say, they've got resources in opposition to do that. That is a good predictor of what the trajectory would look like to 2050s. But they don't want to do that because they don't want to have to show their hand, which is where they were at the last election. So this is happening, yes, around the world too. They push out these numbers. So 2050 sounds like a long way away, but it's 10 elections in the Australian context, and it binds then future governments. And I know with the moderates, with the power they have in the party room in Canberra, would be in a position, even if a Conservative was there as leader, saying this is not what we want to do, that we will keep those models within sort of the frame time of, you know, a decade or so, and we'll protect jobs and protect industries. Once Labor locks into a 2050 target, I tell you, the Libs will fall in line as well. And so that's why they're pushing so hard here and around the world on 2050.
Well, that's foolhardy, and it goes against the wishes of the Australian people because, yes, in the polling, people will say, look, they regard climate change as a legitimate issue, and it is. But the polling also shows, and election results bear this out, people don't want to pay for it with their job. They don't want to pay for it with the economic security of their family. They don't want to pay for it with 30% of their household income lost in the foreseeable future. So this is the problem, and it's the great deception of Australian politics to have these policies out there. Albanese in Canberra, Matt Keane and Berejiklian in Macquarie Street, Sydney, with so disrespectful attitude to jobs and the economic well-being of families, they won't tell people what it actually means in dollars and cents for the future, and most importantly, your employment security.
All right, I want to get to a revelation today in relation to the New South Wales Education Department, but just before I do, there's a lot of auditioning going on today. Front page of The Australian, Tanya Plibersek was there. Richard Marles, in his press conference with Anthony Albanese, was clearly shaking his tail feather. If Albanese goes, or when Albanese goes, who will replace him?
Well, who knows, and does it matter as long as they've got that bad policy for 2050 there? But let me just make an observation about Richard Marles. He's been elevated today to some sort of employment czar inside the Labor Party, and I think it's a sign of perhaps a fractured relationship between Albanese and Jim Chalmers, who's supposed to be the Shadow Treasurer. You don't hear much from the Shadow Treasurer. It's almost like they're saying Marles is going to be a second spokesperson on the economy and employment now, in a very much beefed up shadow portfolio. So I thought that was interesting in the internal manoeuvring. Either Albanese sees Chalmers as some sort of threat and he wants a second economic spokesperson there, and Marles looks like he's going to overshadow the Shadow Treasurer himself, who really should be number two in the pecking order of any capable fighting opposition.
All right, let's go to the report today in the Daily Telegraph. The New South Wales Department of Education, led by the bloke who used to run the ABC, Mark Scott, I might add, $30,000 for what, paint, curtains and carpet, if you can believe it, inside government offices in Parramatta. What's it all about?
Well, Peter, we've resumed the school year, and certainly when it warms up, there'll be children sitting in classrooms without air conditioning, without decent ventilation, absolutely overheated. And they needed this $35,000. Instead, it's been spent on a room in the Department of Education head office in Parramatta that's called a culturally safe yarning circle, where they took out the furniture and put in Indigenous patterned stools and Indigenous patterns on new windows, and they say this will keep Indigenous people in the department culturally safe. Well, what an absurdity. As if there's a single Indigenous person in the Department of Education head office who would feel culturally unsafe. I mean, it's virtue signalling at the expense of where the money should go in New South Wales school facilities that actually need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought yarning circle might have been some sort of, knitting sort of group.
No, having a chat. Anyway. Having a chat, and they're becoming more popular.
All right.
But in terms of cultural safety,
all right,
about the white blokes getting picked on, they need a bar and a snooker table in the corner to feel culturally safe. That's
Mark
how crazy
Latham.
this stuff has become.
All right. Go and have a glass of wine, have your dinner. It is all good now. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time tonight.
Cheers.